All right, in this chapter 9, we're going to talk about cellular energies and cell respiration. Okay, so if you're an HL student, you need to answer this from a TOK standpoint. It says Peter Mitchell's chemiosmotic theory encountered years of opposition before it was finally accepted. For what reasons does falsification not always result in an intermediate acceptance of new theories or a paradigm shift? So take a couple seconds and go ahead and construct an answer to that, and then we'll discuss it in class. Okay? So the main idea here is that cell respiration supplies the energy for the functions of life. And that energy, of course, is in the form of ATP, and that's the usable form of energy, for the cell, and it's made available through cellular respiration. Okay, so the chapter is going to deal with energy production and taking the catabolic pathways that break down these organic compounds such as sugar or glucose and use that to produce ATP. So whether you're talking about gasoline or sugar, the general equation is some organic compound, and we see that right here. Okay, some organic compound is going to be combusted or burned in the presence of oxygen. It doesn't necessarily need to be using a flame, but burned, and then it's going to give off with complete combustion carbon dioxide, water, and then a little bit of energy in the form of ATP or an explosion to drive the pistons of a car, for instance, to move the drive shaft, etc. All right. So cell respiration now is the process of oxidizing food molecules into CO2 and water. And the food that we're going to talk about in our examples is glucose. But really any type of food is we can use that for cellular respiration. We can funnel it into some of the pathways. So proteins, fats, and then other forms of carbohydrate, of course, can be funneled into cellular respiration. But C6H12O6, that's the compound that we're going to use. That's the glucose compound that we're going to use when we talk about cellular respiration. So it's important to recognize here essentially what's going on. We've got a series of redox reactions or oxidation reduction reactions. And if we take, for instance, switch my colors here. If we take, for instance, this molecule right here, some methane, and we burn it in the presence of oxygen, we're going to get some carbon dioxide, we're going to get some water vapor, and then energy in the form of heat, for instance, on our stoves to boil water. So if you've ever have a stove that makes a ticking noise when you turn it on and then a blue flame comes out, and if you've got like a silver pan or something like that on the sides of it, you can see briefly at the very beginning some water vapor coming off or some steam forming, and that's what's right there. Okay, and what we're basically doing is we're taking a highly reduced form of carbon. In this case, it's got a lot of hydrogens on it, and for biological purposes, when we look at things that have lots of hydrogens on it, we can say that it's a highly reduced form. And then if we look right here at the CO2, the carbon dioxide, you can see that there's no hydrogens on there. In other words, it's been fully oxidized. So this is an oxidized form of carbon. And then we're going to take water here and we're going to reduce it. Okay, so we took the oxygen, I should say, the oxygen here, and we're going to reduce it to form water. So when we basically transfer these hydrogen ions to the oxygen atom, we're reducing that. Okay, so these in whatever it is that becomes oxidized, okay, the oxidizer here, in the case of oxygen, is going to strip these electrons. It becomes reduced. So that's a general redox reaction. So in each of these cases with catabolic types of reactions, we say that the delta G is negative. It's an exergonic type of a reaction, and we can say that the end products are less organized than the beginning products, or the end products are less organized than the reactants. And in this case, for instance, if we look at the methane, we can say that this is a more organized structure than either carbon dioxide or water. In this energy, okay, the energy that's being given off in terms of the flame and so forth, we can say that we've increased the entropy. And if you guys remember the talk, the randomness or the disorders, the best way to think of entropy here. So the entropy is going to increase with these exergonic types of reactions. So what we're talking about, generally speaking, with this whole idea is we have a compound that contains some energy in it, and the best way to utilize that energy is in small discrete steps. So for instance, if you take a can of gasoline and you throw a match at it, it's going to explode and give off all of its heat and energy really in one giant explosion. And of course, that's not going to move a car very far. But if you take that gallon of gas and you put it in an automobile and you release it very, very small, in very, very small discrete steps, such as when the fuel injectors inject the fuel into the cylinder of the engine, and then the spark plug ignites it and it drives down the piston. That piston is used to turn the drive shaft of the car. In small discrete steps, we can use that gallon of gasoline to move the automobile a long way. That's because we're controlling the release of the energy from the gas. And our cells are going to do the same thing in cell respiration. They're going to take the energy that's contained in the bonds of the food, and it's going to break those bonds. It's going to liberate small amounts of energy, and that small amount of energy is going to be used ultimately to help us form some ATP in these small discrete steps, and much more efficiently than just burning it very rapidly. Okay, so these processes that we're talking about that transfer energy, this takes place as these electrons get transferred through the electron transport chain down to oxygen. And again, it does so in these very small discrete types of steps that are very important in the process of taking ADP, adding a phosphate to it, and giving us some ATP energy here. That's what we're ultimately after. And this ATP, of course, is the available source of energy for the cell. That's the cellular energy currency. Okay, and it's going to do so in these small discrete steps that we said. For instance, we're going to take these food molecules, glucose in this instance, we're going to take off these hydrogen ions, and the electrons are going to come with it, and then ultimately the oxygen is going to get reduced to water, and in the process we're going to generate ATP that our cells can use. Okay, so here's another example of a redox reaction. For instance, we have sodium and we have chlorine, and this is commonly used in your chemistry class, which I'm going through it again just to kind of refresh your memory here. And you can see that the sodium atom is going to give up an electron to the chlorine, and in the process it's going to form a positive ion. And that chlorine, because it accepts the electron, it's going to have one extra negative charge, and it's going to now be negatively charged. So now these two, of course, are attracted, and we'll get sodium chloride. So this is a redox reaction, and there's things that you've probably heard before. We've got Leo-Gur. Leo the lion says Gur. So this is lose electrons oxidized. So in other words, sodium here is losing the electrons, and it's becoming oxidized. And then Gur is gain electrons reduced. So this chlorine atom here is going to gain electrons and become reduced. And another commonly used acronym here is oil rig. Oxidation is loss in terms of electrons, and reduction is gain, again, in terms of electrons. So this chlorine ion, or this chlorine atom, we should say, becomes reduced because it's gained an electron. Okay, and the sodium atom is oxidized because it lost an electron, and now it's positive. All right, so that's just a little review. Now oxygen, because of its kind of proximity to fluorine, that upper right hand corner of the periodic table, oxygen is very electronegative. It's a very powerful oxidizing agent because it has the ability to strip the electrons off of many other atoms. And in doing so, when we're running these redox reactions, and using the oxygen to do this, the electrons get moved closer to oxygen, and in the process, small amounts of energy are given off, and this energy is what's going to be used ultimately to generate ATP. Okay, so we talked about some of the similarities of burning gasoline in the car. And if you think about an automobile and the miles per gallon, that type of a thing, generally speaking, they're about 15% efficient. So they're very inefficient, in other words. And a lot of the energy is given off, of course, as heat, friction with the road, air resistance, those sorts of things. And our cells are about 40% efficient. So, almost 3 times more efficient than a very efficient automobile. So that burning of the glucose in our cells and the burning of the gasoline in the engines are similar examples, but it's important to know that the cells are much more efficient in doing so. Okay, so here we see this is the reaction we'll be talking about with cell respiration. There's our glucose molecule. Here's the oxygen, and then the CO2 and the water that's being given off, and then in terms of the energy that we're after, there's the ATP. So when we look at this, we can see that this has a lot, I know it's got some oxygens on it, but it's got lots and lots of hydrogens on it. So this is a reduced form of carbon. Okay, and then if we look at oxygen here, of course, there's no hydrogens on there, so that's our oxidizer. And then what we're going to do is oxygen is going to help strip the electrons off of the glucose, and in doing so it's going to become reduced. The hydrogen ions and the electrons are going to move together to keep the charges balanced. And this carbon dioxide, this is the oxidized form of that carbon. So in other words, it's lost, this carbon here has lost its hydrogen atoms to the oxygen, and it's become oxidized, and then the oxygen, of course, is becoming reduced. So in that process now that's going to take place in the mitochondria of our cells, we're going to generate a lot of ATP, and that ATP, of course, again, is cellular energy currency. That's the thing that's going to enable us to stay alive and in our cells to be able to do the work that they do. Okay, so now if you just think about some of the things we've talked about in the past with regards to, say, the electrons, there's an activation barrier that needs to kind of be overcome, a certain amount of energy that's required to kind of do these jobs here, and enzymes are going to help to lower this activation energy barrier. Okay, they're going to lower the barrier down, and this is why, for instance, glucose doesn't burn in air. So it doesn't burn in air because the amount of energy really required in order for this to occur is much higher. Glucose very, very slowly will combust in the air, but it's made much more rapid in our cells because of the enzymes that are going to help power this. So the enzymes are going to lower that activation energy, help us burn this energy, burn the sugar to liberate the energy in the bonds, that potential energy that's stored in the bonds of glucose, and it's going to be used to of course, power the production of the ATP that our cells can then, very easily use. All right, so as far as glucose metabolism is concerned, the most efficient way we've said is to do this in very small, discrete steps. And these organic fuels, such as glucose, are used by the body, and each step along the way is catalyzed by a specific enzyme that, of course, isn't important for us to know. It's just important to know that they're run by enzymes. And at key points in the process, these hydrogen or atoms, I should say, get stripped off of the intermediates and they get transferred to this electron carrier. This NAD plus is an electron carrier, and this is going to form NADH. Now that's the important electron carrier that we need to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so in a series of steps now, this NADH is going to transfer the electrons ultimately to oxygen, and that's what we're breathing in. Okay, that's why we need the oxygen, and this is what's going to make up the electron transport chain, or the ETC. This is the thing that's important for us that we're going to be talking about in more detail later on. Okay, and this electron transport chain is consisting of many proteins found within the cristae, or that inner mitochondrial membrane. And each of these steps is going to be involved in glucose metabolism, and all along the way you'll see each one of these proteins that's involved is more and more electronegative. In other words, it's going to continuously pull these electrons down the electron transport chain, ultimately reaching oxygen. And oxygen is the most electronegative kind of component of this electron transport chain, and that's where the electrons are going to get transferred to. And then ultimately, of course, this is what's going to form water. And if you've ever exhaled onto a mirror and seen the steam, that's the water vapor coming from that. And of course, you're getting rid of the CO2 as well. Okay, so we'll see you here in part 2, and we'll continue on.